The Ethiopian Bible describes where souls wait the truth about the chambers of the dead. Every tradition in the ancient world agrees on one thing about death, that the dead go somewhere. What they disagree on is where and what it looks like when you arrive. The modern church reduced the destination to a binary, heaven or hell, the saved and the damned, with death as the moment of verdict. That framework is clean, easy to teach, and almost entirely absent from the oldest texts in the biblical tradition. The Bible's own ancestors, the texts that existed before the canon was assembled and voted on, describe something far more specific and far more unsettling. Not heaven, not hell. A waiting place. A holding structure divided into distinct compartments, each with different conditions for different categories of the dead, where souls wait in full consciousness for a judgment that has not yet come. The Ethiopian Bible, which preserves texts the Western Church removed in the 4th century, describes this waiting place in precise architectural terms. It describes the spring of water that runs through one compartment. It describes the darkness and the silence in another. It names the compartment that holds the souls who were murdered. And it records the sound those murdered souls make, a sound that has been heard since before the flood. If you have ever wondered what actually happens between death and the Last Judgment, the answer is in a text the church called too dangerous to keep in the Bible. That text has been sitting in Ethiopian church libraries for 17 centuries. And in the next several minutes, you are going to hear what it actually describes. If forbidden biblical history and the truth about what awaits after death has ever made you stop and wonder, subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications. Every week, we go deeper into what was removed from Scripture and why. Now let's get into it. The Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church holds a biblical canon unlike any other Christian body on earth. Its Old Testament includes books Western Christianity excluded in the 4th century: the Book of Enoch, the Book of Jubilees, the Book of Ezra Sutuel, the Ascension of Isaiah, and others with no equivalent in the Catholic or Protestant traditions. The Ethiopian canon is not a smaller Bible with additions. It is the larger, older Bible with the controversial portions still intact. When the Council of Laodicea voted in 364 CE to restrict which texts could be publicly read in churches, the Ethiopian Church, operating independently from Rome, maintained its existing canon without revision. What was removed in the West was preserved in Axum. The most significant preserved text for the question of what happens to the dead between death and judgment is chapter 22 of the Book of Enoch, belonging to the Book of the Watchers, the oldest section of Enoch. It is preserved in Ge'ez manuscripts at the Church of Our Lady Mary of Zion in Axum and in Aramaic fragments found among the Dead Sea Scrolls in 1947. Fragment 4, Q 204 at the Israel Museum, contains portions dated to approximately 150 BCE. Dr. Michael Knibb of Oxford, whose 1978 translation remains the scholarly standard in English, identified chapter 22 as containing the most detailed description of the intermediate state of the dead in any ancient Jewish text. The intermediate state is the condition of the dead between death and the final judgment, a period the text treats as extended, real, and specific. The chapter opens with Enoch being led by the archangel Uriel to a place in the west, toward the ends of the earth, where he sees a great mountain. Within the mountain are hollow places where the spirits of the dead are gathered. The Ge'ez term used for hollow places is the same term used elsewhere in the Enochic corpus, for sealed chambers built with deliberate architecture. Enoch is not looking at an open plain. He is looking at a structure with rooms. Uriel identifies the purpose directly. This is the place where the souls of the dead will be gathered until the day of their judgment and the great consummation. This is not a permanent destination. It is a holding facility with a defined endpoint. What Enoch then describes is not a uniform darkness or a vague spiritual realm. He describes 4 distinct compartments within the mountain, each with different conditions, each designed for a different category of the dead. The full Ge'ez manuscript tradition at Axum preserves the description of all 4 compartments with more detail than the Aramaic fragments or the later Greek recensions that Western scholarship relied on before the Ethiopian. Manuscripts became accessible through the work of Dr. Ephraim Isaac, who produced the 1983 Oxford translation directly from the Ge'ez tradition. The first compartment is for the righteous. Enoch describes a bright spring of water running through it. This is not metaphorical language. Enoch consistently uses the grammar of direct observation throughout this passage. He sees the spring, he records the light. Uriel describes this compartment as set apart for the righteous, in the way that a place of honor is set apart. They are not being punished, they are not in darkness. They exist in the best conditions the waiting structure offers, but they are waiting. The judgment has not come. The spring is not the river of life from Revelation. It is the conditions of the waiting place before that final state is reached. The second compartment is where Enoch hears a voice, a detail that establishes the dead in these compartments are conscious, aware, and capable of communication. The voice coming from the second compartment is identified by Uriel. He tells Enoch that this is the spirit of Abel, specifically Abel, the son of Adam, who was killed by Cain, and that Abel's spirit is making suit against his brother, crying out for judgment that has not yet come. This is one of the most specific details in the entire chapter. The murdered dead are not silent. They are actively present, aware of their condition, and aware that their murderers have not yet faced accounting. The J's text uses the word mesleen for the action Abel is performing, which carries the connotation of bringing a formal legal complaint, filing a suit. Abel is not screaming into the void. He is engaged in an ongoing formal act before heaven, requesting justice. Uriel then tells Enoch that this compartment holds those who were slain in the days of the sinners, not just Abel, but all who were murdered unjustly, all who cry out for justice yet undelivered. They are separated from the righteous not because of any fault of their own, but because their specific case requires the final judgment to resolve. They are witnesses to crimes that are still, from their perspective, unanswered. The third compartment is described differently. The text says this compartment was made for spirits who make their complaint, and those who disclose information concerning their destruction when they were slain in the days of the sinners. Western editions of Enoch have handled this compartment in various ways because the Ge'ez and Aramaic texts differ slightly here. The most complete reading from the Ethiopian tradition, as Dr. Ephraim Isaac noted in his translation commentary, describes a compartment for souls who are neither righteous nor of the category of the murdered innocent, but who are not among the most deeply condemned. They are waiting for a different kind of resolution. The fourth compartment is for the souls of sinners, and Enoch's description removes any ambiguity about what awaits certain categories of the dead in the intermediate period. Uriel specifies that these are the souls of those who do not cry out, because they will not be completed or punished in the age of the world. These are sinners who prospered during their lifetimes, who died without visible punishment, whose crimes produced no visible consequences in human experience. They wait in the fourth compartment because their accounting is still outstanding. They will be brought to stand in judgment when the day comes. But in the waiting period they are bound and in pain, because they lived and died without consequence, and the balancing of that account has been deferred to the final reckoning. This four-compartment structure is the most architecturally specific description of the intermediate state in any text from the ancient Jewish or early Christian world. It has a direct mirror in the New Testament that has been sitting in the Gospel of Luke for 2,000 years, hiding in plain sight, because without the Enochic background, the parable it appears in seems like a literary device rather than a geographic description. Luke chapter 16 records what is usually called the parable of the rich man and Lazarus. A rich man and a poor man named Lazarus both die. Lazarus goes to a place described as Abraham's bosom, a phrase the text clarifies means a place of comfort. The rich man goes to Hades, which the text specifies is a place of torment, with flames. The rich man can see Lazarus from where he is. He asks Abraham to send Lazarus with water to cool his tongue. Abraham refuses and says this, and it is the sentence that locks the passage into the Enochic framework. Between us and you, there is a great chasm fixed, so that those who wish to come over from here to you will not be able, and that none may cross over from there to us. A great chasm, fixed, between compartments that are separated but not isolated, because the inhabitants can see across the divide and communicate across it. This is not heaven and hell. This is the four compartments of Enoch chapter 22, described in the words of Jesus with the specificity of someone who knows what the intermediate structure looks like. The righteous side has a spring of water in Enoch. In Luke, it is Abraham's bosom, a place of comfort. The sinner's side in Enoch is separated and in pain. In Luke, it is flames and torment. The chasm that prevents movement corresponds precisely to the separation between compartments that Uriel describes to Enoch. This is not an allegory. Jesus is describing the waiting structure that Enoch chapter 22 documents in architectural terms. 1 Peter chapter 3 verses 18 through 20 adds another layer. The passage records that after Jesus' death on the cross, he went and made proclamation to the spirits now in prison, who in former times did not obey. The Ge'ez term used in the Ethiopian tradition's parallel text for the condition of these souls is meshagert, carrying the sense of being held, detained, awaiting resolution. Peter is not describing a metaphorical mission. He is describing a visit to the waiting structure Enoch documented, a structure that by the time of the crucifixion still held souls from before the flood. The Hebrew word Sheol, which appears in the Old Testament 65 times and is typically translated as the grave or the pit, is the same structure. When the psalmist writes in Psalm 88 that he is counted among those who go down to the pit, when Jonah cries out from the belly of Sheol, when Isaiah chapter 14 describes the king of Babylon descending to Sheol, where the shades of departed rulers mock him, these are all references to the holding structure Enoch visits and describes. The ancient Hebrew writers knew exactly what they were referring to. The vagueness was introduced later, when the texts that gave Sheol its specific architecture were removed from the canon. Egypt enters this conversation with a parallel tradition that is older than the Hebrew texts and described with even more architectural detail, and the Egyptian description of the afterlife holding structure aligns with the Enochic framework in ways that scholars have noted without fully pursuing. The Duat, the Egyptian underworld, is described in extraordinary detail in the Amduat, whose full title translates as that which is in the underworld. Its full version was first inscribed in the burial chamber of Thutmose III around 1425 BCE, but the tradition it encodes is understood by Egyptologists to reach back to the Middle Kingdom and likely earlier. The Amduat describes the sun god Ra's journey through the underworld during the 12 hours of night, passing through 12 successive gates or divisions, each with different conditions, different inhabitants, and different categories of the dead. What distinguishes the Amduat from a vague myth is that its architectural descriptions are spatial and specific. Each division has a name, each has a guardian figure, each has a population of souls whose condition is described with reference to what they did during their lifetime. The Hall of Two Truths, which the dead pass through in the Duat, is the most precisely documented judgment mechanism in any ancient religious text. The process is described consistently across Book of the Dead papyri and the Papyrus of Ani, the most complete surviving example, held at the British Museum and dating to approximately 1250 BCE. 42 divine assessors each govern a specific category of wrongdoing. The deceased addresses each one and declares innocence of that specific offense, a process called the negative confession. Afterward, the heart of the deceased is weighed on a scale against the feather of Ma'at, the principle of cosmic order. Anubis manages the scale. Thoth records the result. If the heart is light, the soul proceeds to the field of reeds, the Aru. If the heart is heavy, it is fed to Amit, a composite beast described as part lion, part hippopotamus, and part crocodile, and the soul ceases to exist in any form. The field of reeds, the Aru, is the destination of the justified dead in the Egyptian system, reached after the judgment in the Hall of Two Truths rather than immediately at death. In the waiting period before judgment, the Egyptian texts describe a holding state with differentiated conditions that mirrors the Enochic compartment structure. Those condemned in the Hall of Two Truths are fed to Amit, and their annihilation is described as the second death, a phrase that appears in the Book of Revelation and that many readers assume is a Christian concept introduced in the New Testament. The Egyptian tradition records it centuries earlier. The second death is the permanent dissolution of the soul after judgment, distinct from the first death, which is the physical separation of soul from body. The connection between the Egyptian Hall of Two Truths and the Enochic compartment structure is not one of direct borrowing. It is one of shared cultural memory describing the same underlying reality through different theological vocabularies. Both describe a structured intermediate state with distinct zones for different categories of the dead. Both describe a judgment mechanism that occurs after the waiting period, not at the moment of death. Both describe the soul as conscious and aware during the waiting period. Both describe conditions that correspond to the moral quality of the life lived, and both describe a category of souls whose final disposition is permanent dissolution. Babylon approaches the question from a different direction, and the contrast is as revealing as the parallels. The Babylonian tradition of the afterlife is recorded primarily in the Descent of Inanna, preserved in Sumerian on tablets dating to approximately 1750 BCE and held at the University of Pennsylvania Museum and the British Museum. The text describes the goddess Inanna descending through 7 gates into Kurnugi, the land of no return, the Sumerian and Akkadian name for the underworld ruled by the goddess Ereshkigal. At each gate, Inanna surrenders an item of clothing or divine regalia until she arrives stripped of everything. The text describes Kurnugi as a house of darkness, where those who dwell do not see light, where they are clad in feathers like birds, and where dust is their food and clay their bread. It is called the land of no return because no one leaves. Not the righteous, not the sinners. Everyone arrives at the same destination. This is the crucial distinction between the Babylonian and the Enochic traditions. In Babylon, death is a great equalizer. The good and the wicked share the same dust, the same darkness, the same clay bread, When the ghost of Enkidu speaks to Gilgamesh from Kurnugi in tablet the 12th of the epic, he says that the man with many sons weeps with his sons, the man with no sons weeps alone, and all of them eat dust. Righteousness during life confers no advantage in Kurnugi. Wickedness confers no additional punishment. The Babylonian afterlife is the same experience for everyone. The Enochic tradition, preserved in the Ethiopian Bible, describes the exact opposite. The condition in the intermediate state is specifically and intentionally differentiated based on the moral content of the life lived. The righteous have the spring. The murdered innocent have the ability to cry out and be heard. The sinners who prospered without consequence wait in pain for an accounting that is coming. The structure is not punitive in a simple sense. It is pre-judgment, a period of holding that reflects the incomplete state of cosmic justice before the final reckoning settles everything. But it is not uniform. The conditions differ. The intermediate state in Enoch, and in the Ethiopian Bible, is a structured moral holding facility, not a common dark waiting room. The Akkadian text called The Vision of the Netherworld, preserved on a tablet from Ashurbanipal's library at Nineveh and held at the British Museum, represents a Babylonian attempt to introduce differentiation into the afterlife structure, notable precisely because it is so anomalous within the Babylonian tradition. The tablet describes a young man who visits the netherworld and encounters the god Nergal, around whom scribes record the deeds of the dead. Individuals are judged and sent to different locations based on those records. This partial differentiation appears to draw on contact with Levantine traditions rather than emerging from the core Babylonian theological framework, and looks, from a textual standpoint, like an outside influence working its way into the Babylonian scribal tradition through cultural contact. The suppression of the specific architectural knowledge of the intermediate state begins at the Council of Laodicea in 364 CE. Jerome, compiling the Latin Vulgate around 400 CE, translated the Hebrew Sheol consistently as infernum, a Latin term that did not carry the compartmentalized meaning the original Hebrew word implied to anyone who knew the Enochic background. Augustine, writing in the City of God around 410 CE, argued that the intermediate state of the dead was not a matter for specific theological description because its details were not clearly revealed, preferring a framework of two general categories, the blessed and the damned, awaiting the final judgment. Neither man denied that an intermediate state existed. Both resisted giving it the specific interior architecture that Enoch provides and that Luke chapter 16 assumes. The resistance was partly theological and partly institutional. The compartment structure in Enoch chapter 22 creates a problem for simple pastoral communication. If the righteous do not go immediately to heaven at death but wait in a bright compartment until the final judgment, and if the sinners do not go immediately to hell but wait in a dark compartment in pain until the final judgment, then death is not the final verdict. The final judgment is the final verdict. And if the final judgment is still outstanding, then the theological leverage of death as the moment of ultimate determination loses some of its force. The church had institutional reasons to want death to be decisive. Enoch chapter 22 places the decision elsewhere. The Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church has never faced this institutional pressure because it never adopted the Western simplification. Its liturgical tradition, its funerary prayers, its theological teaching about the state of the dead all reflect the understanding that the dead wait in a structured intermediate state between death and the final resurrection and judgment. The church prays for the dead not as a gesture toward an already settled verdict, but because the intermediate state is a real condition in which the status of the dead has not yet been finalized. This is not a uniquely Ethiopian theological innovation. It is the position of the oldest available texts, Enoch, Luke 16, 1 Peter, the 42nd Psalm, when read against the Enochic background. The Ethiopian church did not invent this theology. It preserved the theology that already existed before the 4th century councils decided which texts were too specific to be left in circulation. What we are left with when we read the Ethiopian Bible's account of the chambers of the dead alongside the Egyptian Amduat's 12 divisions and the Babylonian land of no return is a picture with enough internal consistency to constitute a record rather than a collection of myths. All three traditions describe the dead as conscious between death and the final resolution of their condition. All three describe a structured, intermediate environment with distinct zones. All three describe a judgment mechanism that determines the final destination, not the moment of physical death, but a formal process that comes afterward. The Egyptian and Enochic traditions both describe differentiated conditions based on how one lived. The Babylonian tradition offers the starkest contrast by presenting a uniform darkness for all, a position so bleak that it seems to reflect a theological choice to deny cosmic moral differentiation rather than a window into the actual state of the dead. Enoch chapter 22 is not a metaphor about mortality. It is a first-person account, written in the same matter-of-fact testimony grammar Enoch uses throughout the Book of the Watchers, of a specific geographic location containing specific architectural features, specific compartments, specific categories of occupants, and specific conditions. The archangel Uriel serves as guide and provides direct explanations. Enoch records it the way someone records what they saw. The spring is in the first compartment. Abel is in the second, making his complaint. The sinners in the fourth are in pain. These are not poetic flourishes. They are the kind of detail that survives in testimony because someone was present and noticed them. This account has been sitting in Ethiopian church libraries for 17 centuries, read aloud in liturgical services, preserved in Ge'ez manuscripts by monks who understood they were maintaining a document the Western councils had decided was too specific, too structural to leave accessible. The church that removed it has spent 17 centuries teaching a simplified framework that cannot explain what Jesus describes in Luke chapter 16, cannot explain what Peter describes in his first letter, cannot explain why the Old Testament writers describe Sheol with the specificity of people who know what it looks like inside. The Ethiopian Bible keeps those explanations. They are not new discoveries. They are the old answers, preserved by the church that chose to keep them. The dead are not in heaven. The dead are not in hell. Not yet. They are in the waiting structure Uriel showed Enoch, the mountain with the spring, the compartment where Abel still makes his complaint, the compartment where those who prospered without consequence sit in darkness, waiting for the day when the books are opened and outstanding accounts are settled. The judgment is coming. The chambers are still occupied, and the voice that has been crying out since before the flood is still audible to anyone who reads the text the church buried and the Ethiopian church kept.